Right, boys and girls, what I want to show you now, I've gapped the new pistons and I've got 3 of them in the bores already. What I want to show you is the final one, so that you know you do that. It's just a repetition. I started at this end, the rear of the engine, number 4, number 3, number 2, and this is number 1. Turn the crank after every time you put a piston in the bore. Just turn it to make sure it's turning. That does revolve right around, but right now the new pistons are on the con rods, and we gapped the rings as we did before. They're all gapped according to the clock. 1, 4, 8 and 2, 4, 8 and 10. And that's the front, marked on the front of the piston. We'll make sure that goes there. The other thing is, here's the offset. As you can see, I've marked it with a felt pen. You can see quite clearly here. Number 1's offset that way, in towards that way. It follows the shape of the crank, the taper on the crank. And number 2 obviously is that way on. Number 3 and carry on all the way along. Make sure you get those in the right order. That's very important. The next thing we're going to come to is the piston ring compressor. Now I bought this one, just a little cheap one off eBay. Don't know what it was. It wasn't very much, but it does the job. You don't need any expensive tools. And basically you open it up to get your piston, and you slide it over the piston. Let's open it a bit more. Slide it over the piston. When you're tightening your piston ring compressor up, make sure you don't spin it around on the ring, so that it knocks them out of the clock. So I generally just hold it with my thumb like that, and then I just tighten it on the ratchet. Make sure it doesn't revolve around the piston. Try and keep it in one place all the time. It's quite difficult showing you what to do as well as doing the job, but tighten it up, and then just give it an extra. Just move that up that way. Just give it an extra turn to make sure that it is tight. It won't click down anymore. Once you know it's tight, it means that the rings are all nipped up there. And that's that. And that's on. Now that's nipped all the rings up, and there's our facing the front. Now I'll just turn this. When you're installing the pistons in the block, make sure the crank is at the bottom of the stroke, and there's a reason for that. Because if the crank is at the top of the stroke or anywhere in between, you won't be able to knock your piston right in. It'll bang on the crank. It'll damage the face of the crank. So I don't put the shell in till after I've got it in. So that's one thing to bear in mind. Make sure that the the crank is at the bottom of its stroke. I've just got one of the wife's blouses here just to clean things up a little bit. I'll get it in the wash before she gets back, and she won't be any the wiser on that one. So right, I'm just going to turn the engine now so that you can see how we go about this. You know, these engines are not light, but and we've got the engine the right way up now. And there's our piston. You can see the arrow pointing to the front. It is marked front on the piston anyway, so you can't get that wrong. We've got our offset facing the right way, which on this engine it points that way. As you can see, it's that way. We'll just drop the piston into the top and give it a light knock down. And the reason we've got the crank at the bottom of the stroke is so that we know that the con rod isn't going to hit the crank, because the crank's way down here. The con rod's are just about here at the moment, and when we've got that piston in place, it still won't be touching the crank. We only need to make sure it's in far enough to clear the rings. It doesn't take much. As soon as you've felt it, that'll move, and that's that piston in place. And it's not done any damage to the crank because it's not even touching the crank. They're at the top of the stroke, as you can see. Number 4's at the bottom and number 1's at the bottom. So all we do then, just make sure it's in. You don't want it falling out. Then you can turn the engine back over. This isn't easy for a 70-year-old guy. That's the engine back over, and all we've got to do then is lift the piston, lift the conrod up until we see it here. And you can see it's plenty of clearance. We know we've got enough room then to put our shell in. And I'll just put a shell in for you right now. This is one of the shells that I bought. These are, if I remember rightly, there was plus 10,000, 10 over. You just get it lined up with the little recess. Don't worry if you've got a bit of a press to get them in, but they will go in. And give it a little tap if you're having a job. And I mean a little tap, I don't mean a big hammer. I mean just a little tap so that it's located. You're not doing any damage to it, and that's in place. And we get our grease. I'm hoping that this is visible to you. This packet of grease does just do one little engine for the crank, the mains and the shells. And it's coming to the end now. But as I said, you don't need to blather loads on, because all it'll do when you nip the crank up, it'll squash it out. All you're doing is giving it an initial bit of lubrication before it starts up. We've got our bearing cap, and that's already got the shell in. I'll just put a little bit of extra grease on that. And that's our bearing cap. All we do, we get that lined up, and you can just pull it onto the crank. You just pull it on itself, it'll just go straight on. It's not a big raving and chewing about. Pop our cap on. Our new lock tabs, what we got. If you remember, don't forget, boys and girls, very important, is that we don't tighten these, we don't put a spanner on if we can't tighten it with our fingers. Try it the other way around, just to make sure we haven't got anything not lined up. This would happen when it's on the video, of course. Don't tighten anything down with a spanner that you can't tighten up with your fingers first. Remember that little motto. You can see I'm tightening those down with a finger. It's just getting things lined up. Don't force them. If they won't tighten up with your fingers, don't do it. Don't put your spanner on it until you know that it's going to tighten up. I haven't torqued any of these. I haven't torqued these down yet. All I've done, I've tightened them right up so I know that they're all tight. I haven't bent the lock tabs over. I've just tightened them down so that I know they're that the crank turns. It's no good tightening everything down with your socket set if the crank won't turn after you've got it assembled. So after every cap that you put on, make sure you tighten, make sure you turn the crank, because it's no good putting all four on and turning it, because you won't know which one's not seated correctly, which one's holding the job up, so to speak. So only tighten them down one at a time, turn the crank, then do the next piston along, and don't over tighten them. Just nip them down so that you know that they're seated, they're locked in. You don't need to put any pressure on. And that crank, although it's tight because the pistons are new in the bars, and it's just the angle that it's on for me. I'm just slacking that off a bit just to make sure it's seated. They are tight to turn because everything's new, isn't it? You've got to remember that everything is new in this engine, and it's actually awkward. I'm a bit awkward to try and turn it, so nope, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to achieve that. Right guys, that was a little bit of a problem. It's just quite tight actually, because as I say, it's been rebored, everything's brand new, the shells, and obviously I expected it to turn a little easier, but it does turn. It's not overly tight, but you can see everything turns. It just needs bedding in, and all new engines need bedding in. That's turning. I'd like it to have turned a little bit easier, but I don't think there's any problems there. Everything's working as it should. So that's basically, in a nutshell, that's what we've got so far, boys and girls. I don't use an engine stand because I ain't got room for one, but as you can see, everything's all nice and clean, and obviously I'll give it a little buff up before we carry on any further to make sure there's no bits and pieces in the inside the block. But basically that's what we've got there. It's not easy making these videos. I'm not a professional at it. What you see is what you get. Hopefully you're enjoying them. You've seen the problems that we can come across, and you know, you've got to try and get over them. Don't carry on if you've got a problem, so try and solve it. Don't work around it. You shouldn't have any problems. So hopefully you've learnt something there. Nothing goes according to plan, you'll find, with these old engines. You always come across little problems, but once that starter motor gets on there and the flywheel, it'll turn a lot easier. It is because it's brand new and everything's been replaced. They're not normally as tight as that when you're turning them over. If you haven't done the rebar and the rings and the pistons, they normally do turn a little bit easier, and you'll see on one of the later videos where I haven't done a rebar and I've just done the piston ring swap and the shells, mains and shells, so they do turn a little bit easier. This one's a bit tighter, as I said, because it's been standing for a long time, this engine, a good 10 years, and maybe I should have honed the bars out a bit more, but it is what it is. It is turning, it is going to be tight, and it will need breaking in when it's running. So hopefully when we get to that point, you'll see that everything's hunky-dory. So thanks for watching the video, and I hope you enjoyed them. If you like it, subscribe to the channel. Thank you.